By a combination of MI6 and the Central Intelligence Agency, a larger narrative was embraced wholeheartedly, particularly by the senior military leadership of the United States and Great Britain. I think you could probably include Australia to a lesser extent, along with other European powers who want to maintain a disparaging picture of Russia in general, but its military in particular. There has been an attempt to persuade Americans that what we are doing in Ukraine is not dangerous when, in fact, it is very dangerous. If Americans can be persuaded, along with Europeans, that Russia is really weak and incapable, the argument goes that Americans will presumably have fewer objections to the introduction of their military advisors, equipment, and so forth into the conflict. So, did American intel and their Western partners fully, adequately, and accurately assess Russian strength and morale, or did they really and truly believe that the Russian military is dysfunctional and as bad as Ukraine that can stop them or even push them back? In other words, wasn't there a moral obligation on the part of the American Defense Department before involving us in this to make a serious, mature, and accurate assessment of Russia's strengths? I think you're absolutely right. They had a moral and professional obligation both to tell people the truth. But the problem we have in the English-speaking world, particularly in the United States, is a bad habit of disparaging foreign military forces and their leaders, whom we don't really know very well. If you read the assessments of the Germans before we landed at Normandy, they were ridiculous. They painted a picture of a failed army that couldn't present real resistance, incapable of initiative, rigid, and inflexible. Of course, the opposite was the case. It was very much the opposite. We took a similar view of the Japanese. So did the British. If you go back and look at the fall of Singapore and how that came about, and how a British army of 120,000 surrendered to fewer than 60,000 Japanese troops, you have to understand the sort of disdain, even contempt, that we in the United States and Great Britain had for the Japanese, not only the Germans. So, historically, even Europeans who were closer to Russia had a bad habit of misjudging the Russians. Frederick the Great did it, and on one occasion, it almost cost him the total destruction of his army. From that point forward, the Prussians and the Germans, in general, took a different position. But historically, it's always been a problem. Remember, there are too many people in the federal bureaucracy and in the military who are desperate to get ahead. They willingly misinform their superiors by providing them what they want to hear. There's no real room for somebody. Everyone's on the bus to Abilene. For your viewers, if you go and look at the Abilene paradox, it's this groupthink that says no one wants to stand out, everyone wants to be on board, be part of the team. So, everybody gets on the bus to Abilene. This is an old story, a hugely destructive influence. It's very strong in the US military and in our federal bureaucracy. And I suspect in the intelligence community, too. Here's an example of a man who apparently mastered it because he retired with 4 stars. At the time of his retirement, he was the commander-in-chief of military forces in all of Europe. General Ben Hodges made a statement about Russia, which, while relatively brief, was aired over 60 minutes this weekend, and I'm eager to hear your comment on it. If you think about it, Russia has been an existential threat to Europe and the United States for decades. Just listen to what their leaders say. Look at the thousands of nuclear weapons they clearly will keep going if they're not stopped. It sounds like you're saying stopping Vladimir Putin in Ukraine directly benefits every American. Absolutely. This war is about so much more than just Ukraine, Colonel. Well, the Russians at the outset of this war had about 190,000 troops assembled for intervention in Ukraine. Initially, they only sent 90,000 in, and as we've discussed before, I think Putin was under the misapprehension that this would signal his resolve and Russia's resistance to the transformation of Ukraine into a platform for the projection of hostile military power from the United States and NATO toward Russia. Well, he was wrong, and there was no intent to negotiate or compromise, and the rest is history. So, we went from a situation where the Russian military was clearly too small for the mission assigned to it to a Russian military that has grown dramatically and increased in lethality and capability over the last year plus. So, where was the evidence for this dire intent to conquer Eastern Europe before this? And by the way, the Russians have sat in their defensive positions around the territory they gained for months. They've had the initiative now for at least 6 months. There's nothing stopping them from attacking. So, why haven't they attacked? Well, the answer, of course, from the people in the administration and elsewhere is, well, the Russians are incompetent, they can't do it. Well, that's ridiculous. They've been swatting the Ukrainians like flies. The Ukrainians are being annihilated every time they stick their heads up, they're killed. The Russians can clearly attack. Putin doesn't really want to advance any further west than he absolutely has to. The bad news for us is that right now, the Russians have completed between 200 and 300 extra kilometers of rail lines into eastern Ukraine. That's for logistics that indicate the real preparation potentially for a massive offensive toward the west. And I think, once again, Putin is wrong. He thinks he's going to get a negotiated settlement, or he assumes we'll go bankrupt and simply leave. You know, that would be nice, I suppose, in some respects for him, but the bottom line is I don't think it's going to be that easy. Regarding General Zussi, who's the U commander and whom you have said, and your colleagues have said, is respected internationally as a serious military leader, is the Ukraine military poorly led by General Zussi? Is he big-footed by this comedian-turned-politician-turned-president? Remember that everybody in the military side in the officer corps, one way or another, is part of the grift. You have battalion commanders who are pocketing the salaries of soldiers that were under their command, who are now killed in action, preventing their widows from receiving any compensation from the Ukrainian government. Everyone is involved in grabbing whatever he or she can get for themselves. That's the problem in Ukraine. The place is more corrupt than Mexico, and that's saying something if you've been to Mexico. I think you have to keep this in mind. Secondly, Zussi, I have no doubt that privately he has told the truth and he's been ignored, told to shut up, and get back to work. It may well be that he too has been told to do so at gunpoint. I have no idea, so I just think that at this stage, it doesn't really matter. Because at the levels that count, once you get inside the Ukrainian army, there are so many foreign elements directing operations from various places and pushing the Ukrainians into action. There's so much distrust between the soldiers who are being asked to fight and the officers who are commanding them that they whittle down squads to 3 or 4 men to prevent larger formations from forming that might actually rebel. It's a terrible condition, and the people are simply being fed systematically into the so-called meat grinder. Now, we know that over the last several months, there have been a lot of surrenders. There's no question about it. There's plenty of video footage to show that, and I would expect that to continue, perhaps even worsen in time. But it's tragic that we continue to underwrite all of it. We own the place is the 51st state. This was Senator Paul's argument, he's spot on. We're paying the salaries of the government bureaucracy, of the military. What are we not funding over there? It's ridiculous. Well, before the so-called deal, which extended Mrs. Pelosi's spending levels for another 45 days that Congress concocted over the weekend, the president said publicly, "Don't worry, the money will still keep flowing to President Zelensky even if the government shuts down." Do you know if the United States and NATO engaged in an evaluation of the Ukrainian military, its command structure, its support structure, before we started to send $100 billion over there? I know that in NATO, everyone does whatever we tell them to do, Judge. Let's be frank, we dominate NATO. NATO is an extension of our military power, our influence on the continent. The Europeans have made themselves satellite states of the greater US empire and military hegemony. So, that's the first thing. Secondly, you've got large numbers of senior officers, particularly from Great Britain, to some extent from Germany and France, who are all prepared to stand up and defend to the bitter end whatever they're told to do by the United States. They have been completely assimilated into the so-called Borg, if you will. In other words, they adopt what we say, they adopt what we think, they adopt the tactics we suggest. There are some dissenting voices, but they're suppressed. There are people over there that know better. You've had General Kujat, a German retired 4-star, who's been very prominent in Germany, speaking out against the stupidity, saying, you know, Russia is a great power. Whatever made you think otherwise? But he's the Lone Ranger. The vast majority are sort of zombies who simply march in the direction that we send them. So, it didn't matter if you did in NATO a serious evaluation. You were going to be told, this is what you're doing, get on with it or you're out of a job. You mentioned earlier whoever's in charge, of the speaker, McCarthy, when the next deal comes around. We just made one about Ukraine, so we'll find out. But are you worried that he is going to be forced by fellow Republicans to back away from any deal he cuts with you? I hope this experience for the speaker has been one of personal revelation. I'm not being pretentious. Anyway, well, somebody's running the show. Somebody's deciding to spend $100 billion. Somebody decided to ask McCarthy for another $6 billion for a month. Somebody wants the Congress for another $28 billion. I don't know what the mentality of the man we just watched, and I say this with pity, not with joy, is capable of making those determinations. Who are these people that are calling the shots for American foreign policy? Mrs. Nuland, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, but apparently not the man we just watched. Colonel, Judge, if you think about it carefully, there's a wonderful book called Anatomy of a Revolution, and when you read this by Crane Brinton, this comes across a lot like Louis XVI in 1788, 1789, 90. Louis XVI was not a bad human being per se, but he was rather feckless. He was overwhelmed, responded in much the same way, and the people that were advising him were also people that were neither officially appointed in most cases, nor were they obviously elected to anything. And the rest is history. And I kind of think, the more I see of this administration and the more I hear about the things that they're trying to do, sometimes I think we're France before the revolution. There's no direction, there is no one at the helm. We are sort of at the mercy of the prevailing winds, and those prevailing winds for the moment come from the wealthy people that influence and shape policy through their respective minions. People like Nuland, Blinken, Sullivan, and others. How did the Uni-Party and the neocons make this kind of useless, fruitless, expensive, bloody war acceptable to Americans? Is it because no American boys are coming home in body bags, unlike in Vietnam? Well, that's a critical component of it. Yes, first of all, keep in mind, most Americans on any given day, and I try to tell my friends in Europe and Northeast Asia this all the time, and they look at me a little strangely, but most Americans on any given day don't care what happens beyond our borders, Judge. And why should they? If you live in Kansas City, Portland, Oregon, somewhere in Iowa, somewhere in Kansas, or Alabama, your life has very little to do with what happens beyond your borders. And so, we've been in the habit for a very, very long time of consigning responsibility for the conduct of our foreign and defense policy to people in Washington, and we've tended to ask very few questions. What do we have for an ideology leading us right now? This ideology is an ideology of fear. It promotes enemies overseas that we must defend ourselves against. It promotes the notion that free speech and free thinking are dangerous to the American public, that therefore, that must be suppressed. This is a very strange environment, and I think Americans are beginning to realize they've lost control of the government. But this happened a long time ago. People are used to making these decisions in a vacuum. We've decided it's in the interest of the United States that we should put ourselves in a position where we could actually be dragged into a war against Russia. And we all know it's not just Russia. If we end up at war with Russia, we'll be at war with China. Certainly, Iran will come on board. India is not going to help you. The Japanese are going to walk away from you as quickly as they can. So, what does that leave you with? A bunch of Europeans who are not prepared to fight any more than we are. So, this is not a new problem, but it is an old one. And the only way to solve this is to get into that government and root out these people and replace them and find a new way forward. Perhaps that will happen over the next 12 months. I just hope it happens soon enough because right now, we're on the knife's edge. That's the point. People don't understand that this war in Ukraine is over. The prominent Russian politician in the Duma in the parliament who spoke the other day and said the Ukrainians have one of two choices, they can either meet our demands or they can go out of existence. He wasn't kidding, right? Moscow is not going to sit there and let us move anything we want back into Western Ukraine. They're not going to tolerate someone in the government there who is fundamentally hostile to Russia, incurably hateful. They will insist on someone in that government that watches out for Russian national security interests. So, what are we going to do if, for Americans, this were put into a referendum and people were allowed to discuss it for 30 days? I think Americans would come out overwhelmingly against doing anything in Ukraine. But we won't do that, and no one in Washington wants that because they're profiting from this. And the people in Washington think that the United States is still living in 1992, that our armed forces are what they were 30 years ago, that there are no problems, there's nothing that's serious happening here, therefore they have the freedom of maneuver to do whatever they want. That's ridiculous, it's wrong, it's dangerous. That's where we are. Colonel, you're eloquent and brilliant as always. Thank you very, very much for joining us. The column, for those of you that want to read it, which I guess will be out in a day or so, is called Washington on the Knife's Edge in the American Conservative by our dear friend Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Colonel, always a pleasure. See you again soon, sir. Thank you very much. Sure.